My wife asked for a divorce in front of the whole family to teach me a lesson, but I already had the papers ready. In the end, she was the one begging me. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which city you're tuning in from. My name's Alfonso. I'm 31, and until recently I was married to Monica, also 31. Our story didn't start badly. In fact, for many years it was quite stable. We met when we were 24. At a stage when we were both trying to build something, she was finishing her degree, and I was starting to establish myself in my job. During those early years, Monica was different, or at least that's what I perceived. She was attentive, understanding, and had clear goals. We talked about growing together, starting a family, having stability. It was a relationship that looked solid from the outside. Over time, as happens in many long relationships, we started to fall into a routine. But it wasn't a negative routine, more a feeling of comfort. There wasn't as much intensity as in the beginning, but there was trust. I thought that was enough. After 7 years together, getting married seemed like the next logical step. It wasn't an impulsive decision. We talked about it for months. We evaluated our financial situation, our future plans, and what we wanted as a couple. Or at least I thought we did. We got married a year and a half ago, and that's when everything started to change. Living together permanently wasn't what we'd imagined. Before, we each had our own space. I worked, she studied, or went out with her friends, and we saw each other at specific times. There was a balance, but once we shared the same roof, that balance disappeared. Monica stopped working. At first, she justified it by saying she needed a break, that she'd spent years working hard and wanted to take some time to reorganize her life. I didn't think it was a bad idea. I had a stable job, and I thought I could support her for a few months. That was my first mistake. The months passed, and that break never ended. Every time I brought up the topic of her looking for something, a job opportunity, or even a personal project, she always had an excuse that she couldn't find anything she liked, that the offers were bad, that she wasn't in the right emotional state to work. Meanwhile, the household spending started to increase. Unnecessary purchases, constant orders, things we didn't need. At first, I tried not to make a big deal of it. I thought it was temporary, that it would eventually stabilize, but it didn't. What had changed was her attitude. She became more irritable, more demanding. She started to question everything I did. If I came home late from work, it was a problem. If I wanted to rest, it was a problem. If I suggested cutting back on expenses, that was also a problem. I remember one night in particular. I'd gotten home tired after a complicated day. I'd had meetings all day, had barely eaten, and all I wanted was to sit in silence for a moment. Monica was in the living room looking at her phone. "We need to talk," she said without even a hello. That phrase had already become common. I sat down in front of her and waited. "The money isn't enough," she said. I looked at her, not understanding. "I'm covering all the expenses," I replied. "What do you mean?" She made an annoyed gesture. "I mean, we can't live like this. You're always complaining about what I spend." I felt a mix of tiredness and frustration. "It's not that I'm complaining," I told her. "It's that there are unnecessary expenses. We could be more organized." That was enough for the conversation to escalate. "Unnecessary," she repeated sarcastically. "Now it turns out I have to ask your permission for everything." "That's not it." I tried to stay calm. "I'm just saying we should be more responsible." She stood up abruptly. "You're overreacting, Alfonso. You always do the same thing. The same thing as acting like everything depends on you." I looked at her straight on. "Because right now it does depend on me," I answered. "I'm the only one working." There was a tense silence. And then she said something that, although I didn't fully grasp it at the time, marked a before and after. "Without me, you'd be nobody." It wasn't a shout. She said it with a cold certainty, as if it were an absolute truth. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "That I was with you when you had nothing. I supported you. I was by your side. Everything you have now is also thanks to me." I didn't deny she'd been with me during important times, but what she was saying didn't make sense in that context. "I'm not saying you weren't important," I replied, "but that doesn't justify what's happening now." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course it justifies it, and besides, it's not in your best interest to forget it." I felt an unease that was hard to explain. Why isn't it in my best interest? Then she looked at me directly with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Because if I ever decide to leave you, you'll be the one who comes begging me. I didn't answer right away, not because I had nothing to say, but because something inside me started to change in that moment. Up to that point, I'd always try to fix things. I'd been patient, understanding. I justified her behavior, thinking it was a phase, that she'd eventually go back to how she was before. But that sentence wasn't a complaint or an argument. It was a declaration. And the most worrying part wasn't what she said, but how she said it, as if she truly believed it. From then on, the arguments became more frequent. They weren't just about money anymore. They were about everything, about how I spoke, how I thought, even about small day-to-day decisions. Monica started to behave as if she had some kind of moral superiority in the relationship, as if her presence was what validated everything. And I gradually started to realize something I hadn't wanted to accept before. We weren't in a balanced relationship. We were in a dynamic where one demanded and the other provided. I tried to talk about it on several occasions. I proposed solutions, agreements, even couples therapy. I always got the same response: evasiveness, mockery, or outright rejection. "We don't need therapy," she'd say. "I'm not the problem." Over time, I stopped insisting, not because I thought everything was fine, but because I understood she wasn't going to change. And it was at that point that I started to consider something that had never even crossed my mind before: divorce. It wasn't an immediate decision. It was a process. Days, weeks, even months of thinking, analyzing, and accepting reality. It wasn't just ending a year and a half-long marriage, but closing a 7-year chapter. But there was something I could no longer ignore. I wasn't happy. And more importantly, the situation wasn't going to get better. The funny thing is that while I was going through this whole internal process, Monica seemed more and more sure of herself, more convinced that she had control of the relationship. Her comments became more direct. "Let's see how long you last without me. Nobody's going to put up with you like I do. If I leave you, you'll understand what you lost." I didn't respond. There was no point anymore. Inside, however, I was making decisions. I started to get informed. I consulted a lawyer. I reviewed my options. I organized my finances, all discreetly. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because I needed to get out of there in the most orderly way possible. Meanwhile, Monica kept acting as if it were all a game where she had the upper hand, until the day came when she decided she wanted to teach me a lesson, and what she didn't know was that I was already prepared. Making the decision was difficult, but executing it required something more: control. I didn't want the process to turn into another chaotic conflict. I knew how Monica reacted when things didn't go her way. If I just came to her one day and said I wanted a divorce, the situation would most likely escalate quickly. That's why I decided to prepare everything beforehand. I sought legal advice discreetly. I reviewed every detail: assets, accounts, responsibilities. Fortunately, our marriage was relatively recent and there were no children involved, which simplified many things. Still, I wanted to do things right. The lawyer was clear with me from the start. "The most important thing is to have everything ready before you make a move," he told me, "especially if you anticipate a complicated reaction." And I did. For weeks, I gathered documents, organized my finances, and made sure everything was in order. I even prepared a physical copy of the divorce papers that I kept in a folder inside my backpack. My plan was simple: wait for the right moment. I didn't want to do it in the middle of an argument, nor during a tense moment. I thought the most appropriate time would be after a family gathering Monica had organized. It was a meal with both families, something seemingly normal. In fact, when she first mentioned it to me, I didn't think much of it. "We haven't seen everyone in a while," she said. "It would be nice to get together." I agreed without suspecting much. In my mind, that gathering would be the closing, a relatively quiet end point before starting the formal process. I planned to talk to her in private afterward and give her the papers. But I underestimated something. Monica was also planning something. The day of the gathering arrived. Her parents' house was full. There was a lively atmosphere, overlapping conversations, laughter. Everything seemed normal on the surface. I stayed calm, watching, listening, waiting. Monica, on the other hand, was particularly active. She moved from one side to another, talking to everyone, smiling more than usual. but there was something in her attitude that didn't quite fit, a kind of pinned-up energy, as if she were waiting for the right moment to do something. And that moment came. After the meal, when everyone was gathered in the living room, Monica stood up. "I want to say something," she announced. Her tone got everyone's attention. Little by little, the conversations died down. I looked at her, trying to understand what was happening. She looked back at me and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, it was calculated. "I've been thinking a lot about my marriage," she began, "and I think it's time to be honest." I felt several pairs of eyes turn towards me. "Alfonso," she continued, now speaking directly to me, "this isn't working anymore." There was a faint murmur among those present. I said nothing. "I've put up with a lot," she went on, "more than I should have." Some people nodded. Others just watched in silence. "I've come to a conclusion," she added. "I want a divorce." The silence grew thicker. I knew this might happen at some point, but not like this. Not in front of everyone. Monica took a step toward me, but said, "I'm going to give you a chance." I felt a mix of disbelief and bewilderment. "If right now," she continued, "you get on your knees, you apologize to me for everything, and you admit that you failed as a husband, I might reconsider." There were immediate reactions. Some were openly surprised. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. I even heard a stifled laugh somewhere in the room. I stood still, processing. It wasn't just an argument. It wasn't an impulsive moment. This was planned. It was a performance, a way to expose me, to force me to react in front of everyone, to put me in a position of inferiority. I looked at her carefully. She was completely sure of herself, convinced she had control. "Well," she asked, crossing her arms, "what are you going to do?" The silence lasted a few more seconds. Then I stood up. I could feel all eyes on me. Some expected me to react emotionally. Others were simply watching to see what would happen. Monica held her pose. "Come on," she said with a hint of impatience. "Don't make this more awkward than it already is." I took a step toward her, then another. I stopped in front of Monica. She tilted her head slightly, as if expecting me to kneel at any moment. I didn't. Instead, I reached for my backpack. Her expression changed for an instant. Just for a second, a flicker of doubt. I took out the folder, opened it calmly, and, without taking my eyes off her, I pulled out the documents. "There's no need for you to reconsider," I said in a firm voice. "It's already done." I held out the papers to her. Monica didn't take them right away. "What's that?" she asked. "The divorce papers," I answered. "They're already prepared." The silence in the room was absolute. You could even hear some people breathing. Monica blinked several times, as if she couldn't quite process what was happening. "What are you talking about?" she finally said. "The same thing you are," I replied, "except I did it first." I moved the papers a little closer to her. "You can review them." This time she took them. Her hands no longer had the same confidence as before. She began to flip through the pages quickly. Her expression changed from confidence to confusion, and then to something closer to discomfort. This can't be," she murmured. "Yes, it can," I replied. "And it is." Some people started to react. An uncle of hers let out a short laugh. "Wow," he said. "Didn't see that coming." Another voice, this time from a cousin, commented loudly. "That's what she gets for pulling stunts like that." "It was unnecessary," someone else added. "Nobody needed to find out like this." The reactions started to multiply. Not all were in my favor, but many agreed on one thing. The situation had completely slipped from Monica's control. She looked up. "Are you serious?" she asked. "Completely," I replied. "You prepared this behind my back." "I prepared it because it was necessary." Her expression changed again. This time there was anger. "This is how you do it," she said, as if I don't matter. I looked her straight in the eye. "This isn't new," I replied. "It's been happening for a while." She clutched the papers tighter. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she muttered, almost to herself. And that's when it became obvious. None of this had been improvised. She expected a different scene, one where I gave in, where I was exposed, where she had the last word. But it didn't happen that way. "If you want a divorce," I continued, "here you have it." Some people started to murmur more intensely. One awkward situation. This got out of control. They shouldn't have done it like this. But among those comments, there were also more direct ones. She asked for it. Nobody does that without expecting consequences. It was ridiculous. Monica heard everything, every comment, every reaction, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have an immediate response. She had no control, and it showed. She stood in the middle of the room with the papers in her hand, surrounded by looks that were no longer of expectation, but of judgment. I didn't add anything else. It was no longer necessary. The awkward silence that had formed in the room didn't last long. As often happens in these situations, once someone breaks the tension, everything else unravels. And the person who did it wasn't an adult. It was one of her younger cousins, a boy of about 16 who'd been watching the whole scene from the back with that mix of curiosity and lack of filter typical of his age. He let out a laugh without trying to hide it. "Ha ha, what an idiot," he said, pointing at Monica. She wanted to make him look like a simp, and ended up being the Jigga-Chad. "That's what you get for being a bitch." The sentence landed like a rock in the middle of the room. For a second, no one reacted, and then the laughter started. They weren't exaggerated guffaws, but they were enough to completely shatter any attempt to maintain an appearance of formality. Some people try to contain themselves, others just couldn't. It wasn't just the phrase itself, it was the context. The scene Monica had planned to humiliate me had been completely reversed, and now she was the one exposed in front of everyone. "Calm down now," one of the adults said, though without much emphasis. "Don't talk like that," but the damage was already done. Monica stood completely still for a few seconds. Her gaze moved from one person to another as if looking for support, a different reaction, something to balance the situation. She didn't find it. That's when one of her cousins, a few years older, spoke. She wasn't laughing. She said it with a serious, almost cold expression. "You're pathetic, girl." That phrase had a different effect. If the boy's comment had caused laughter, that one caused silence. A heavy silence. Monica looked down, and that's when her composure finally broke. Her hand started to tremble slightly, still holding the papers. Her eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. She tried to say something, but her voice broke. She brought a hand to her face, trying to compose herself, but it was clear she no longer had control of the situation. The scene she prepared had turned into something completely different, something she couldn't handle anymore. She looked up again, this time directly at me. There was no more arrogance, no more confidence, only desperation. "Alfonso," she said with a trembling voice, "I didn't think things through." I didn't answer. She took a step toward me. "It was a mistake," she continued. "I was just upset. I wanted you to understand how I felt, but it wasn't supposed to be like this." I looked at her in silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd heard enough versions of that kind of apology in the past. "I wasn't serious," she added quickly. "About the divorce. I wasn't serious." She raised the papers slightly, as if that could reinforce her argument. "This is," I replied. Her expression tensed. "No, you can't be serious," she said. "You can't end everything like this." "It's not like this," I replied calmly. "This has been coming for a long time." She shook her head several times, as if trying to reject reality. No, you're exaggerating," she said. "We can fix this." She took another step toward me. "Please," she added. "Forgive me." That word hung in the air. Some people in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others simply watched without intervening. I was still in the same spot. "You didn't think things through?" I repeated. "That's what you said." She nodded quickly. Yes, that's what it was. "I didn't think." "That's the problem," I replied, "that you never think." The silence returned. Monica opened her mouth, but didn't say anything right away. "It's not the first time," I continued. "It's not an isolated moment. It's a pattern of behavior." She looked down again. "I can change," she said in a low voice. "Really?" I shook my head slightly. "You've said that before, too." Her lips trembled, but this time it's different. I looked at her steadily. I didn't answer. This time it just backfired on you. That sentence hit her harder than any other. She stood completely still, as if she didn't know how to react. "No," she murmured. "That's not it." "Yes, it is," I said. "You planned this." I didn't raise my voice. "It wasn't necessary. You organized this gathering. You waited for the moment. You said exactly what you wanted to say." She denied it. though without much conviction. No, You wanted me to kneel, I continued, in front of everyone. The silence in the room became even more uncomfortable. You wanted to humiliate me? I added. And you were sure it was going to happen. Monica wasn't looking at me anymore. I didn't think you'd react like that, she said, almost in a whisper. That's the point, I replied. You never thought about anything other than what you wanted in that moment. She clutched the papers tighter. Please, she repeated, don't do this. She took another step, closing the distance between us. I don't want to lose you. There was no drama in my expression. No visible anger, just exhaustion. You already lost me a long time ago, I said. That was the first time some people in the room reacted with more than just discomfort. A sigh, a slight shake of the head, a look that confirmed the obvious. Monica brought both hands to her face and began to cry openly. She wasn't trying to maintain any image anymore. No, don't say that, she sobbed. We can fix it. We can go to therapy, do whatever it takes. I suggested that before, I replied. You didn't want to. She shook her head desperately because I didn't understand. But now you do. Now you understand because you've lost control, I said. There was no reply. It's not enough. The silence settled in again. Monica slowly lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. Her breathing was uneven. So is that it? She asked. Yes. 7 years, and they end like this. They don't end like this, I replied. They end after a long time of being worn down. She looked around as if suddenly becoming fully aware of where she was, of the people, of what had just happened. I didn't want this to happen like this, she said in a low voice. No one answered because deep down everyone knew she did, that every word, every action had led exactly to that point. I took a step back, not for dramatic effect, but because there was nothing more to do there. You can have a lawyer review the papers, I said. Everything's in order. She didn't reply, just held the documents as if she didn't know what to do with them. The scene was over, but not as she had planned it. After that gathering, we didn't have another long or emotional conversation. There were some attempts on her part to contact me during the first few days, texts, calls, even more elaborate apologies. But I didn't respond like before, not out of pride, but because I understood that prolonging that exchange would only delay the inevitable. Every legal step has been handled in an orderly manner. There were no major disputes because in practical terms there wasn't much to divide. A 1.5-year-long marriage doesn't leave too many material ties, but it does leave lessons. During these days, I've had time to think more clearly, not just about what happened that day, but especially about what led up to it. And if there's one thing I understood, it's that the problem wasn't a single scene. No matter how intense it was the accumulation, the small, normalized signs of disrespect, the unresolved arguments. The way the relationship gradually stopped being a space of support and became a constant field of tension. What happened in front of the family didn't create the breakup. It just made it visible. Monica tried to turn that moment into a demonstration of control, a kind of choice for me, but it ended up being the opposite. It was the end point. I don't feel satisfaction about how things turned out, nor do I feel resentment. What I feel is something much simpler. Relief. Relief for having made a decision I should have considered sooner. Relief for having stopped justifying the unjustifiable. And above all, relief for having understood that a relationship isn't sustained by history, or by time, or by what it once was, but by what it is in the present. Today I'm focused on rebuilding my routine, on reclaiming personal spaces I'd set aside, and on returning to a more stable, calmer life. The divorce isn't completely finalized yet, but it's only a matter of time, and this time there are no doubts. It's the closure I needed.